class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 61 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Colorado Avalanche, in which the Sharks have lost 4-3. So just a few days removed from playing against the league's second-ranked team in the standings, the Sharks face off against the first-ranked team in the standings. That is the Colorado Avalanche, about 91 points coming into the night. That is 30 more points than the San Jose Sharks currently sit with. So especially in the second half of a back-to-back, not many people were necessarily expecting a victory here tonight for the Sharks, and honestly it would have been just impressive for it to be kept competitive, and that's exactly what ended up happening here tonight. The Avalanche kind of had to watch their backs here, as even though the Avalanche, definitely they were the better team here tonight, they had the puck for much more often than the Sharks did. They had the offensive zone time. However, the Sharks, when they got the opportunity to get that puck, they actually made it count significantly. They accumulated a very nice amount of high danger opportunities, and if there were maybe a couple of bounces one way for the San Jose Sharks, for instance, the goal that actually ended up getting called off just an inch or two offside for Logan Couture, or maybe the post hit by Balcers after the beautiful setup pass from Erik Carlson, or maybe the Timo Meier opportunity early on in this game these types of plays could have made the difference. And so yes, the Sharks lost. It's hard to say they deserved a victory here tonight, but it was definitely a significantly improved game from the previous one against the Los Angeles Kings just yesterday, and the fact that that happened against the league's best team is quite nice to see. Obviously, in the end, it is still a regulation loss, and at this point, with tonight's regulation loss and last night's regulation loss, the very, very small glimmer of hope for a playoff spot grows even smaller. And at this point, I think since the Sharks are pretty much out of it, not mathematically, but they're pretty much out of it, I would like to see maybe a bit more liberties taken with how the lineup is actually going to be shaking up game in and game out. I think it'll still take a few more games before Bob Booner believes that the Sharks are out, but even though this was a nice little morale type of boosting game, in the end the Sharks still lose, and that's 0 points in the standings. Moving on to how this game went, it certainly didn't start off particularly well, obviously, as the Sharks would give up the first 4 goals of this game, 2 of them in the first period and another 2 in the second period, to trail to the Avalanche 4-0, kind of expected of how this game would end up going. The Sharks didn't have really a lot of shots on net during those first 2 periods, but like I said, they had a couple of very strong opportunities, just none managing to go in the net, or at least the one that did go into the net didn't end up actually standing. But it would be Jeff Viel, of all players, to actually break the shutout from Pavel Francouz late in the second period, in the last few seconds of it, to give the Sharks a bit of life. And with that bit of life, they'd actually kind of run with it in the third period. The Sharks would continue to pick up some decent opportunities, and would actually, you could argue, were the better team in that last 20 minutes, as the Sharks would get goals from Balcers, and then with the goaltender pulled Erik Carlson to bring the game to within 1. Unfortunately, once Carlson scored, the Sharks kind of seemed like we're in a situation where they didn't think that they would get that far, so they didn't exactly know what to do, trailing just by 1 goal. And so for the last few seconds, we had to watch the Sharks just kind of flounder a bit and not be able to even connect a single pass. And eventually the Avalanche would get the empty net goal. I have it written here 4-3. It was actually a 5-3 loss, as Val Nichushkin would score and on the empty net, and that would do it for the game. On to the players to talk about. We have the first line here of Meier, Couture, and Dahlin, and one player who I do want to point to somewhat positively here tonight was Logan Couture. As we know, Couture has historically been a player who in the regular season has never been super apparent. He's had some really strong regular seasons, certainly, but his playoff game is usually at another level. But over these past few seasons, the Sharks have obviously not made the playoffs, and so we really haven't been able to see a lot of that sort of next level Logan Couture play throughout many of these past couple of years, and that could be a big reason for why he's had this kind of decline over the past 2 seasons. But here tonight, he definitely looked like, not right there with playoff Couture, but definitely a lot more like a classic Couture. I thought he had some really nice plays here tonight. Obviously, there was that goal that he did score on the offsides that got called off. It was a very close call, and it was a very nice play from Logan Couture to actually score that one. So even though it didn't count, definitely do still have to give him credit for that. And generally, while this wasn't a fantastic game for this first line, and considering who they had to match up against frequently here tonight, that's not that surprising. But it's nice that they didn't pretty much get pummeled into the ground, and I think Couture was a big part of that. With the second line, we had Rudolph Balcers returning to his spot there in favor of John Leonard, who actually ended up being a healthy scratch here tonight, obviously joined by the usual suspects of Hertl and Barabanov, and this line was quite solid here tonight. Maybe not at the same level as they were in the previous game against the Kings, where Hertl had like 2 or 3 grade A chances just by himself, but Barabanov had a couple nice looks. Obviously, I mentioned earlier that Balcers had hit the post, and Hertl himself looked pretty good. This was probably the Sharks' best line of the night, I guess you could say, though the first line was relatively close to them. When it comes to the third line, Nieto, Cogliano, and Bonino were once again kept together, and once again were just absolutely disastrous here tonight. You want to know an interesting stat? Andrew Cogliano was on the ice for 0 San Jose Sharks shot attempts. That's right, 0. And that's not 0 shots, because that happens every so often to be on the ice for 0 shots for. This is shot attempts. Players didn't even attempt to take a shot when the Sharks' third line was on, or at least when Cogliano was on the ice. This means that pretty much Cogliano was in the defensive zone for the vast majority of this game. And it wasn't that Cogliano just played like 3 minutes of ice time and then got injured or something like that, so it just so happened to be the case. Cogliano had just over 10 minutes of even strength ice time and yet could not find a single shot attempt for the Sharks. This third line is just been a complete sieve for the Sharks this season, and a possession black hole is a term I sometimes like to use, and for whatever reason they continue to be put together. Maybe this is for some reason a lack of a better option, because I know the Sharks' penalty kill has been extremely successful this season, and these 3 players are all pretty integral parts of that Sharks penalty kill, and so you want to kind of keep them in the lineup, but you don't want to necessarily put them on like a top 2 lines. Obviously, you can sometimes flex them onto the 4th line, but it's kind of an awkward situation, so I understand the pain, but at this point you kind of just have to separate these 3 players. It is not working. When it comes to the 4th line, we obviously had a couple of substitutions here tonight. Like I mentioned earlier, Leonard was a healthy scratch, so was Noah Gregor. That one struck me a bit by surprise. Not too surprising that Leonard would sit out after the past couple of games that he did have, not really doing much of anything. However, Gregor, I thought, had a couple of solid chances against the Kings, so I thought at the very least he did enough to stay in the lineup, but instead both Gadjevich and VL stepped back in, and surprisingly enough, they didn't look half bad. This 4th line actually generated a goal, as I mentioned earlier. VL, the unlikely suspect to score to break the shutout late in the second period, and I also thought in particular Scott Reedy stood out in a relatively positive way. Nothing super impressive, but I especially liked late in the game when the Sharks had the goaltender pulled. They pulled Sachenko with about 3.5 minutes left in the third period, and so they obviously sent out the big guns for a while, but eventually they obviously can't play those full last 3.5 minutes, so the Sharks had to send in a couple of other players to fill out those spots, and Reedy was one of them. And I actually thought he looked pretty good in the 6-on-5 situation, so that was quite nice to see, and maybe that could mean something going on to the future. Probably not, but maybe. On to the defensive side of things, the first player who I do definitely want to talk about would be Erik Carlson. The past couple of games, I've talked about how his defensive game has been somewhat spotty, but he has been making some really strong offensive plays, and that is once again the case here tonight versus the Colorado Avalanche. There were just a couple unbelievable, beautiful passes made by Erik Carlson. Obviously, he scored a very nice goal here tonight as well to bring it to within 1. That pass to Rudolph Balcers that ended up going off the post in the backdoor play was also extremely impressive. However, in the defensive zone, Carlson had a lot of issues. You see, the thing about Carlson's game is that a lot of the time he doesn't necessarily look for that one pass to take this puck out of the zone. A lot of the times he himself will try and use his speed and skill to carry it out of the zone. But the problem is that while that works a lot versus most teams, the Avalanche themselves are an extremely skilled and especially fast team, and they can sometimes abuse Erik Karlsson for that, and they did it a couple times here tonight, in particular on the Darren Helm goal, which was the second goal for the Avalanche. It's hard to blame Karlsson a ton here because it felt as though he didn't really have much support from his team. He kind of got swarmed by 2 or potentially you could even say 3 different Avalanche players, but you saw he tries to carry the puck out of the zone, but the quick work of the Avalanche players who are forechecking around him managed to separate him from the puck and allow this Darren Helm goal to actually end up materializing. So there were a couple of bad giveaways for Karlsson here tonight in his own zone in front of the net, so definitely not good defensively, but it's hard to necessarily look past those offensive plays. At the very least, he's still doing better than, Burns at times this season, who is also making those terrible plays defensively, but there's not really much offensive upside coming from him either. A couple of other players to mention here tonight. I thought I mentioned this actually in a tweet during the game. I thought Vlasic probably showed the most heart here tonight than he has in the entirety of the season. At a point, it was JT Compher, I believe, who ends up going in the Sharks' crease, getting kind of in Sachenko's grill, and so Vlasic ends up just muscling him out of the crease into the boards, ends up getting, I believe it was a roughing penalty for 2 minutes, but it was just nice to see a bit of emotion and Mark Edward Vlasic's game, which I felt has been severely lacking for most of this season, and honestly it kind of dates back a couple of years. I understand it's hard to get fully engaged into a team that is not necessarily going anywhere, but still, it's your job and you kind of have to show up, and Vlasic, at the very least here tonight, showed up on the emotional side of things. And finally, to mention, the goaltender Zack Sachenko gets the start here tonight. Definitely thrown to the wolves a bit, having to face off against the Avalanche. And we just saw of these 4 Avalanche goals, multiple of them were just extremely skilled, very difficult saves. Even Darren Helm, who's not necessarily a traditionally super skilled player and is like a 4th liner, I suspect, for the Avalanche, even he showed off some very nice moves and a very nice shot to get this one past Sachenko. So I wouldn't really blame him for many of these. The Kadri one was the tip. I mentioned the Darren Helm one already. The Makar one was just absolutely insane, where it's like a shot gets blocked straight to Makar, beautiful shot on the rebound. Just generally, Sachenko, he did his best. Obviously, it's hard to say he was great tonight, letting in 4 goals, but I also don't think he was particularly bad and not necessarily at fault for the loss here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday, where they will take on the Arizona Coyotes. So the Sharks go from first place team to pretty much dead last team in the league. I don't think the Coyotes are actually dead last, but they're very, very close, and we'll see if the Sharks can actually take advantage, but they do have to be careful. While the Coyotes, 2 months ago were just extreme pushovers, just couldn't seem to buy a win. As of late, the Coyotes have not only been actually winning games, but they've been kind of creaming teams as well, getting 4 or 5 goals per game. They had a 9-goal game just the other night against the Detroit Red Wings. I believe Nick Schmaltz had managed to put up something like 15 points within just 2 games. So the Arizona Coyotes are kind of rolling as of late. So the Sharks, even if they might think earlier on this could have been a relatively free 2 points, they do have to be rather careful. Class dismissed.